Has there been discriminatory policies in Canadian immigration since it officially became its own country on July 1st, 1867? Well, in order to answer that important question, we shall dive into the obscure history of Canadian immigration, often overlooked and disregarded. Italians were among the first Europeans to arrive to Canada. Some of the most well-known explorers include Giovanni Caboto in 1497, Giovanni Verrazzano in 1524, and Francesco Giuseppe Bressani in the 1640s. So alternatively, the first Chinese immigrants to arrive was in 1788 when a group of 50 Chinese artisans who accompanied Captain John Mears settled in Canada. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, they arrived to help encourage trade in sea otter pelts between Guangzhou, China, and Nootka Sound, British Columbia. This was soon proved representative of the Chinese immigrants' role in Canadian economy. The major periods for Chinese immigration ranges from 1885 to 1923 and ever since 1947, whilst for Italians it became known that they immigrated to Canada from 1900 up until World War I and from 1950 to 1970. So now you may be asking yourselves, if the Italians and Chinese have been here since the dawn of Canada's conception, has there really been any discriminatory laws against them? Well, the answer will be an affirmative yes, and in order to demonstrate it, we should look through the laws established through time. One of the first pieces of legislation to restrict Chinese immigration was proclaimed after the investigation published by the Royal Commission of 1885. In brief, the commission was appointed in order to quote-unquote obtain proof that restricting Chinese immigration was in the best interest of the country. Even though the Chinese were considered cheap and reliable labor for the construction of the Pacific Railway Road, built between 1880 and 1885, many witnesses called to testimony for the investigation reported that the Chinese were immoral, dishonest, unclean, prone to disease, and incapable of assimilation, basing their testimony on common stereotypes rather than personal experience. Some even went as far as to say that Chinese communities were overcrowded and filthy, with gambling, prostitution, and opium smoking. Others protested that the influx of Chinese workers created competition for white labor, preventing immigration from more desirable white European migrants, such as the British. However, the support for Chinese immigrants came solely from employers who sought out cheap labor in order to derive economic benefits. The Commission proposed an imposition of a $10 duty per Chinese person upon entry to Canada. Following the recommendations published in the Royal Commission, the federal government imposed the Chinese Immigration Act, implementing an increased duty of $50, becoming the very first piece of Canadian legislation to exclude immigrants on the basis of their ethnic origin. The execution of the duty only succeeded in temporarily reducing the number of Chinese immigrants, as the continued economic growth in British Columbia created a demand for easy labor, leading to an influx of immigrants by the 1890s. In return, Ruffin-Laurier's Chinese Immigration Act of 1900s increased the duty to $100 per Chinese person entering Canada. In 1903, to fully deter Chinese immigration, the Canadian government increased the duty to $500 per Chinese person seeking entry, making immigration prohibitive for most Chinese immigrants. However, it didn't last long, as Chinese immigration once again increased as Canadian labor contractors started advancing money to the Chinese, facilitating their entrance into Canada. In brief, the interests of business and industry continued to exert considerable influence over the flow of immigration despite the implementation of restrictive immigration policies. As for the Italians, a royal commission was called in 1904 to quote-unquote investigate the exploitation of Italian laborers by employment brokers known as padroni. Padroni meaning owner in Italian. As the influx of immigrants came from the economically depressed regions of southern Italy, such as Friuli, Venezia Giulia, Calabria, Puglia, etc., the unskilled laborers were required to meet industrial demands, finding work mostly on the railway and in the mines. These seasonal workers tried to make enough money to improve their economic situation in Italy. However, the system of sojourning labor was rife with corruption, as the padroni inflated fees for brokerage, transportation, and food supply. One of the most well-known padroni was Antonio Cordasco, who hired Italian laborers for the Canadian Pacific Railway. He had charged 60 to 150% above cost, including fees for arranging the employment and charges for supplies and food that were deducted from their wages once they were hired. Following the conclusion of the commission, the CPR fired Cordasco, but the system remained intact as major companies employing Italian seasonal workers continued to use padroni to obtain cheap labor. After the First World War, new restrictive immigration regulations were put in place, as unemployment increased and the post-war atmosphere generated suspicion of quote-unquote enemy alien immigrants. The government introduced the Immigration Act Amendment of 1919 in an effort to protect the country from dangerous ideologies and subversive activities. By saying so, immigrants from countries that fought against Canada in the Great War were specifically prohibited, but other inadmissible immigrants included the mentally and physically defective. The acquisition of permanent residency was increased from 3 years to 5 years, therefore granting the governor and council the power to deport immigrants at any period of time if they became a member of an inadmissible class, meaning that they were suspected of being a part of anti-government activity. Further amendments granted the governor and council the capacity to prohibit immigrants of any nationality, race, occupation, or class if they were deemed unsuitable to the conditions and requirements of Canada, may be climatic, industrial, social, or educational. All of this due to the concern that these immigrants might have peculiar customs, habits, and their inability to become assimilated into Canadian society. In brief, the Immigration Act of 1919 demonstrated the importance of ethnic, cultural, and political considerations in immigration policy. Finally, another piece of legislation was passed to restrict Chinese immigration once again, the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923. It was passed by the Prime Minister William Mackenzie King in response to the continued demands of more prohibitive regulations limiting Chinese immigration. It's commonly referred to as the Chinese Exclusion Act because it virtually restricted all immigrants by narrowly defining the acceptable categories. The poor economic conditions of the post-war period were blamed on visible minorities. The Immigration Act was passed into law on July 1, 1923, coinciding with Dominion Day. The Chinese would soon refer to this day as Humiliation Day and refused to participate in ongoing Canada Day celebrations for years to come. The law proved extremely effective as only 15 Chinese immigrants came from its conception in 1923 until its repeal in 1946, a measly 15 immigrants for a period of 23 years. An honorable mention will be the internment of Italian Canadians during the Second World War. Under the War Measures Act of 1940, 31,000 Italians were considered as enemy aliens, as 600 men were interned at camps such as Petawawa, Fredericton, Kananaskis, and Kingston. The men were stripped of their identities and forced to work in internment camps, alongside the German, Japanese, and other such people considered traitors to the country. This difficult period involved the ransacking of Italian homes and businesses, the uncertainty and the humiliation that entailed. Despite contributing to the war effort and the Canadian economy, many men were arrested without reason. However, on May 27th of 2021, an official apology was given by the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to the Italian internees.
Make amends.
Mr. Speaker, Signor Presidente, I rise in this House today to issue an official apology on behalf of Italian Canadians, on behalf of the Government of Canada, for the internment of Italian Canadians during the Second World War.
However, throughout the years, Canada would improve its immigration policies in order to become more inclusive. In 1971, Pierre-Luc Trudeau announced the Canadian multiculturalism policy, intended to, quote-unquote, preserve the cultural freedom of individuals and provide recognition of the cultural contributions of diverse ethnic groups to Canadian society. In consequence, the government assisted the ethnic groups in their developments, assisting them in overcoming discriminatory barriers such as language and encouraging intercultural exchange.
For immigration, and the immigrants is not too difficult to find all the information and the help, and also to learn the language. There are many different choices. Actually, Canadian government even pay the immigrants to learn French.
In 1988, Canada would be defined as the first country to pass a national multiculturalism law, desiring to protect the cultural heritage of all Canadians, reducing the discrimination and encouraging the implementation of multicultural programs and initiatives. The effects of these multiculturalism laws are still seen to this day, notably with the Festin Culturel that takes place every summer in Brossard. These showcases of culture demonstrate multiple ethnicities, one of which is Chinese culture. Canada is an increasingly diverse country, as data from a 2016 census indicated that 1/5, meaning 21.9% of the Canadian population, arrived through the Canadian immigration process. Furthermore, 2.2 million children under the age of 15, so 35.7%, are either first or second generation immigrants. Projections from 2017 predict an increase in percentage by 2036, with the amount of immigrant children rising between 39.3% and 49.1% of the total population of children under 15 years of age. All in all, immigration has been a major benefactor for the development of Canada, more importantly, its economic development. They usually took on more dangerous jobs, such as the construction of the Pacific Railway, and suffered for the greater good of the country. Although misunderstood for a good amount of time, immigrants are the backbone of our society. Canadian society is deeply rooted in immigrant culture, maybe job-wise or what they brought with them. These migrants brought bits and pieces of their home, and along with others, created a collage, transforming Canadian society into a big melting pot, and a unique one at that. In conclusion, there have been discriminatory policies regarding the immigration of Chinese and Italians to Canada. Such examples include the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923, the Italian Internment, etc. Our country is not and will not be exempt from its racist and prejudiced past. However, it remains clear that the Canadian government has established certain laws in favor of immigration and repealed the biased ones from the past, such as being the first country to initiate a multiculturalism policy. Personally, I feel as though the country as a whole has a lot to work on, specifically regarding the perpetual mistreatment of the Indigenous people, but also several instances of xenophobia and hate towards Asians connected to COVID-19. Discrimination remains a societal issue that thrives on ignorance. In consequence, it's important to study Canada's past, the good, but most importantly the bad, in order to change our society for the better and avoid history repeating itself.
Nella storia ci sono state ingiustizie in tutti i paesi e contro tutte le popolazioni. Purtroppo quella è una fase che non penso neanche i canadesi siano felici e orgogliosi. Gli italiani non sono orgogliosi del loro periodo fascista, però è avvenuto e ci sono delle cose buone e delle cose cattive anche in quello. E le persone che sono venute qua e sono state trattate in quel modo sono state ingiustamente trattate in quel modo. Però è stato un periodo della storia.